Hey guys, how's it going? This is Jay here, and me and Justin just got together. We asked a question on our Twitter account, kind of asking people for questions to ask us general questions about NBA, really, and what our thoughts were. And the questions came in, and they were all really, really good. So we decided to do a quick pod and break them down. Justin, how's it going?
Pretty good. You just kind of had to find a way to make it up to you guys for not getting a pod out for Monday. Some last minute things came up, and so yeah, we don't want this to be another 2 hour special between Jay and I. So let's dive right into these questions and get started. All right. So MK Hubbard asked, "What is the number one tip for setting the best lineup?" And I'll start this out by just saying that this goes back to kind of our strategy part where I told you to not just go in blind and play a fully optimized lineup. I think you need to know why you're playing certain players and really just like the players that you're playing. I don't think you ever want to get in a position where maybe you end up comfortable with seven of your players and they just kind of like put in a couple other players just because they fit the salary. I think you want to always kind of rework and tinker your lineups to where you feel comfortable from top to bottom, and you don't come in with a lineup that you're kind of on the fence about or you're not really confident in. So that's kind of my number one tip. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, to go along with that, I think giving yourself enough time to kind of gloss over every single position in your lineup and make sure that they're all optimal plays. You don't want to just have 7,200 left and put a 7,200 guy in just because it fits. You really want to take time and make sure your lineup is, exactly what you're looking for and what you want. I really think bias plays a huge role in lineup making, and I think that's a huge tip to kind of realize that you need to kind of get over your biases. Rajon Rondo's a good example. We all despise him right now, but you have to put your hatred aside when Darren Collison's out. There are examples like that, or a player burned you last game, so you don't want to go him. Stuff like that. You have to have a short memory and realize that you're trying to make the best lineup you can, and it's different night to night. And you really got to focus on looking at each play and making sure they fit.
All right, so next question, the Dustin Krieg. Biggest difference in low stakes to high stakes. I'll be brief and then toss it to you, Jay, and I'll take it back. Probably the biggest difference is just, you're not in high stakes. Those guys don't make a lot of mistakes, and they're not going to be a lot of holes in their lineup, and they're going to be on the plays that you might think are sneaky but really aren't. I think Jameer Nelson, maybe goes a little underowned relative to high stakes. If people weren't fully aware that Emmanuel Mudiay was out, for example, things like that. Things like, a coach will say this player will play a lot of minutes or more minutes than usual. Little edges that you can usually exploit in those lower stakes. You definitely cannot find them in the higher stakes. You kind of have to be a little bit more contrarian, a little bit more outside the box than usual to beat that caliber of player, because there's just not a lot of mistakes. Yeah, you just have to be a little bit sharper for sure.
Yeah, one of the things with high stakes that I first learned was I saw some really bad lineups, and it kind of gets you thinking like, wow, these guys are worse than the low stakes guys, the grinders, you can kind of think of it, and they just have a lot of money to blow. And you see guys play in like 535s even or whatever that play a guy who's out and think, oh my gosh, this is really beatable. But I've crunched my own personal numbers through a lot of games, and my win percentage is very linear with the lowest stakes being the highest stakes being the lowest. So it's something to think of if you're at that kind of 25, 50 head-to-head range and you want to jump up or go up even more. It's something to look at. When you get to the really high stakes, or even the baller or the high stakes tournaments, it's more game theory. You're playing a lot of the same people in these types of games. If you're posting 1K head-to-heads, you're going to get a lot of the same action. A lot of those guys. The other thing to focus on is if you do want to make that jump to high stakes, you got to realize this is something that you just have to know, is that if you're posting out the board and, you got these high stakes guys looking for action, they see some young blood on that board, you better believe they're going to go fishing, and you're going to learn sooner or later that you're going to have to beat these guys to kind of stay on the board. And that's kind of the hardest thing with high stakes. And a lot of it plays into your bankroll. Obviously, you don't just want to play high stakes to play high stakes.
All right, so next question is from TJ Cousins 1. How can you generally predict ownership percentage in GPPs? All right, so two kind of big things that go into predicting that. Number one is recent performance, recency bias. I think players who have been on a hot streak, who have been killing it, who have been crushing value lately, will be highly owned, just because you're not gonna play the guys who are in an extended shooting slump. You're gonna play the guys who are have been averaging 40 DK points over last week. I mean, that's probably the most surefire way to predict ownership. The second probably being news injury related items, especially ones that come out early. The fields in general have been a lot sharper in recent years, just because the number of resources, the number of tools that they have at their disposal. So, if a guy's declared out or actually has already been declared out like the day before or early in the morning, then you better believe that his replacement, who projects to have a pretty high point per dollar ratio, will be pretty highly owned. So, those are the two biggest factors for predicting ownership for me.
Yeah, for me, the value plays are by far the easiest to predict. Things like Jameer Nelson tonight is a perfect example. You just have to assume he's going to be high owned, and if you want to be contrarian, you can fade him in a tournament. You can get more unique lineups. One way you can do it is I like to kind of build my cash lineup and see all my plays and think, okay, why did I play this guy? Because he's in a perfect scenario. And then boom, you got a guy you think, okay, this guy has everything going for him. He's been playing well lately, like Pau Gasol or whoever's been on fire. It's an easy matchup. Those are the types of guys you can kind of say, okay, they're going to be highly owned, and you can pivot to guys in a similar price range to get unique lineups. Tonight, more than ever, I think, chalk plays are so highly owned. Tonight's a great example. It's a 10-game slate, and there were multiple people 70% owned. So these are things you definitely get used to more, kind of projecting ownership the more you play. You'll kind of be aware of where these guys are going to be projected at, how many people are going to own them. And I think that's something you got to look at when you're playing tournaments to predict and then pivot off those and try to get your unique contrarian plays.
All right, so let me toss it straight to you. This next question here from Chuckus Maximus. So many variables in picking optimal lineups. Can you identify a few key areas new DFS players must focus on?
Yeah, this goes back to, I think it was our first or second question, just making sure all your players make sense. I think that's like one of the main things to focus on. I focus on position by position, and I do top plays. Like Jameer, for example, again, tonight was kind of a guy who I focused on last night when we knew Moutier was out and whatnot. So he's a guy I threw in there and I focused on, okay, what is the best lineup I can build with Jameer Nelson? Each play has to be advantageous, right? You have to have each play make sense. You don't want to just get lazy and throw a guy in just because he fits or be, you have your lineup and then you think it's the perfect salary cap. So that's the one you're going to go. It's really important. The key area is to make sure that player by player makes sense. Think of it like a puzzle, and you're fitting all the best plays, but you need to sacrifice a few pieces in certain areas to get that overall product.
All right. So next question, Eric Bradner. How do you use the Fantasy Labs models in setting lineups? How closely do you stick to its top-rated players for cash games? All right. So being the guy who does the projections and pretty much dictates the model, I'll be very forward with you on how I would do this. I would use the models and the ratings as a baseline, as a guideline, as kind of like your number one, your first building block. I would not follow anything, period, just verbatim and just use it blindly. I think what I would do is go position by position, like Jay said, take the top 5 or 6 top rated players in the model and then parse each one individually and figure out, which of the guys that you like. I would never just tell you blindly, okay, my model says this player is number 2 in my model amongst point guards, you have to play him over the number 4. There's a lot of cases where the rating differential between these guys are marginal at best. There's not much of a difference, and then you have to you have to take other factors into account, like blowout potential, game flow, matchup, hot and cold, recent performance. There are a lot of, ceiling and floor. There are a lot of things that you have to take in potential, in addition to just the raw rating of the model. So again, I would just take like the top 5 or 6 out of position, then parse them, go individually and see which one out of that group that you like the best.
Right. And yeah, I'll get into this a little more, I think, in 2 questions with kind of deciding between 2 or 3 guys at the top. But yeah, personally, I go position by position. I broke it down in a cash game video, kind of pretty much exactly what I do. I stick to the top rated players really closely, but it doesn't mean I'm going to take the top point guard over the second point guard, or the third, or the top center over the third center. It's all kind of individual basis. And another thing I want to say is, setting your lineups, I don't use the optimizer. I go position by position, or if you have guys who are clear-cut value plays, or guys who are really expensive that you think are just a lock, everything's going for them, you can kind of lock those guys in and then use the optimizer. But I think it's important to kind of look at it in terms of, this is your building block, but now why are you choosing between A and B?
Yeah, and it goes back to our first point too with the optimizer. It's like liking the players that you're putting in, not just trying to fit guys in because you have X amount of salary left. I think, our optimizer is a great kind of learning tool, a crutch to use. But ideally, you're going to look at the best players in DFS, the Peter Jennings, the Jonathan Bales. They don't use those types of tools. Like they don't rely on they have to like each player that's in their lineup. There's a reason why each player is in their lineup. It's not because they had 12K left, so they filled it with a 6,500 player and a $5,500 player. Trying to do that math in my head, it was a little troublesome there.
I got your back.
All right, so let's move on to the next question here. The People's J. What percentage of your bankroll should be in play each night? GPP and cash. I'm primarily GPP, but need to even it out. All right, I'll toss this one to you, Jay.
Yeah, this question for me, when people ask it, it depends on quite a few factors, really. Is this disposable income for you? How serious are you in making, a lot of money? You just kind of want to play for fun, or are you more like a grinder and you do this more nights than not? So I think if you find yourself depositing a lot, just kind of throwing in 20, 30, 40 bucks here and there, trying to cash a big tournament, bankroll management's a little different. But if you're throwing in kind of a sum, an amount of money where you're going to grind most nights, a lot of people recommend a lot of different things. There are a lot of books out there that are really good, bankroll management systems. I suggest not really ever going over 10% of your roll. I suggest a small percentage. I've done it multiple ways in the last 4 years. I've done 5%, I've done 25%, and it's a matter of comfort and kind of what your financial situation is, honestly. As far as GPP and cash, that's different depending on the player. GPPs, I would recommend a smaller percentage of your bankroll because you can go 5 or 6 nights in a row without getting any return on your investment. Cash, you're likely to, assuming you're a decent player, you're not going to lose everything, or you're not going to have usually a week where it just cripples you. So you can bet a little bit more in cash. GPP is a little tougher with the fact that you're just not going to cash a lot of nights. So I think it depends on those factors, and just in a vacuum, not more than 10%, I would recommend of your bankroll in a night.
Yeah, I think kind of a very general, broad way to do it is 8% of your bankroll in cash and 2% in GPP, something like that. That kind of ratio makes sense. Just don't overextend yourself on GPPs, like Jay said, because there's more chance than not that you're not going to cash in, because you're basically, your goal should be playing for that top 3 cash where all the money is. So you're not you probably shouldn't be playing for like bubble cashes and GPPs. If you're
Right.
doing it right, you should be playing kind of for I'm either going to score 300 plus or 150, and either going to hit big or just be like 25th percentile or something. All right. So let me see. Next question from his name is #drink. Okay. So
Nice.
what are the most important statistics to discern from a #drink? Okay. To discern top plays on a nightly basis in the NBA. Okay, if we're talking like general NBA statistics, I think you can start with usage rate is obviously the most important one, and then I like player efficiency rating, kind of like a catch-all statistic to kind of gauge the general effectiveness of a player. I think for defensive purposes, using something like defensive real plus minus to gauge individual defenders is a really good metric too. In terms of stuff on our site, I think you can start with projected plus minus is a really good place to start, and and look at floor and ceiling. I think those are probably the three biggest things I look at in our model.
Right. Yeah, I think floor is a huge one really for cash, and ceiling's a great one for tournaments. Sometimes a value play, it's just as easy as looking at a player's price, increased minutes, and increased usage. Kind of sometimes, regardless of the actual talent level of the player, if their price point's right and they're going to get enough production, the team is thin. That's all you can look at. But when you're deciding between two players similar price, I'm of the mindset that kind of the more stats, the better. I like to look at kind of everything. Obviously usage rate, matchups, game flow, things like that are, I think, all important. But it's important to note that this is where biases are built. When you see a stat that plays in hand with your player, you kind of forget about all the other stats maybe, and you think, okay, this guy is just in such a good spot because I saw this one stat. So I think if you're going to go that route and look at other stats outside of our site, if there's two players who are the same price and you're having a really hard time, I would really look at it with an even mind and kind of break down what's the total, what's the pace they play at, what are the advantages that this player is having in this exact game, and kind of break it down by that. So I think there are all kinds of statistics you can look at to kind of make your players better.
Yeah, and going off what Jay just said, pace differential is kind of a cool one too to look at. Just I basically only pay attention to the ones where they're greater than +3 or less than -3, just to kind of see the outliers and which teams are playing very up in pace or very down in pace on a particular night. All right, so next question, St. Fritzy, how often do you tinker with a model? So for me, I don't tinker too much with my model. I think my model personally, my cash model, the fan model, has been the same for about more than a month, maybe 2 months now. I feel really comfortable with it. So for my model, my cash model, I don't tinker often at all. But I think that if you're kind of getting into more GPP territory or trying to experiment with things, and I'm fine with tinkering as much as you feel needed. And ideally why you should tinker is not only to get that plus minus score to be a little higher than usual, but to kind of come up with a model that gives you that rates players that you like at the top. That's kind of you can kind of get you have an eye test a little bit of sorts. If a model if what the ratings a model spits out are right, you can kind of tell right away whether you kind of agree with what it's saying. So yeah, that's my take there. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I really don't ever tinker with the model. I know how much work goes into the projections, and projection is really the main, above all, thing that I look at. Whether I play the first rated guy or the fourth, I'm still looking at the projection above all. And there's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of stats, a lot of information. So I don't usually tinker with the model. I can tinker with my own kind of preference in my head, or I lay out the top players at each position. If I'm doing a GPP, I'll kind of go down the list and be like, okay, where's this guy going to be owned, look at ceilings, floors, stuff like that. As far as the actual model tinkering, though, I don't really do that. The fan model is the way to go.
All right, so I'll toss this back to you. What line of construction? Oh, this is from Eric Walker, 84. What line of construction strategy do you use for small entry contests from 50 to 500 people? Examples are multipliers, boosters, or small GPPs, guaranteed prize pool tournaments.
Yeah, I like this question. I think it's really important to distinguish contest size for your lineups. Obviously, a 500 person GPP should have a lot different lineups than a 95,000 person GPP. So I think your lineup construction for these should resemble more towards cash than straight on like massive GPPs or anything. So I don't think you really need to take chances on like 7 of your lineup spots really in these. But at the same time, I don't think you should really run out a super chalky lineup that you would in cash. I would just kind of lock in 4 guys that you really like and kind of tinker around with those extra spots and see where you have edges and where you can get exposure of players that you think will be under-owned in this type of game. Like we talked about earlier, a lot of high-stakes players, there's information that you can kind of know a lot of people will be on. And I'm not saying you can fade a high-owned guy like Jameer tonight, for example, in these types of tournaments. But I think it's important to note that playing him will lead to decision B and C and D, and you kind of go down that line and you can kind of look at where other guys are going to get their lineups from. And I think you can kind of pivot a little bit in these types of games, but nothing really significant to where you're taking a guy who has a super low floor with a small chance of hitting his ceiling.
Yeah, I think one really good way to kind of mix the two together, the cash and GPP mindset, is to you're playing cash chalky types, but instead of going for the chalk 10K stud, you go for the 9K guy instead. And that gives you a little line of differentiation there. You don't have to play a 9K guy that you don't like. Obviously, there's going to be guys in a level that you're going to be on too, but instead of going with that more conventional lineup construction that a lot of people are going to start out with, paying up for Russell Westbrook or Steph Curry or James Harden, you go down to someone like Blake Griffin instead or something, and then that gives you a whole different lineup dynamic than the other field, and you can still play it fairly safe just with the players you select and have the benefit of being contrarian on top of that as well. All right, so Zach Rab 88, how do you manage cash differently for NBA versus weekly sports? What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, this goes back to bankroll management again, and this is probably a question different for a lot of people. Most times it's kind of put a certain percentage of your bankroll in per day, regardless of sport, kind of, or how many slates you're playing. For me personally, if I put 8% of my roll in on a Sunday in NBA, that's not going to stop me from putting 8% of my roll in for NFL. It could be different for you, but like Thomas Rawls isn't going to kill my NBA team, or try to at least. So it's kind of along those lines of how comfortable you are putting that much money on the line, assuming what can go wrong. I think a lot of it, if you are playing, weekly sports and you're playing NBA every night, that's one day. But if you play both on the same day, it's important to kind of be aware that not to overlook any decision making, because you have kind of more decisions to make in that day. So you might want to go a little less, I think, if you're doing multiple slates, especially if you're not really used to it. It's a lot of work. Some guys play. There have been I think on DraftKings 5 sports in one day before, I think we've had. So it's a lot. And in those examples, I'd recommend just kind of lightening your usual load if you're playing all of those slates on one day.
Yeah, I mean, I would go even insofar as, if you're just starting out, I would maybe even go insofar as suggest you take NBA off on Sunday if you're playing NFL. Just focus all your attention on maximizing one sport, and not just kind of spread yourself too thin and then find yourself losing in both. You'd rather crush NFL. Fine, you don't play NBA, but you're crushing NFL still, rather than take kind of spread yourself too thin and play both, and then end up losing money in both spots. All right, so I know Jay has a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll be really brief. Kizzy913 asks, what are your thoughts on leftover salary? Is there a too much, even if you're comfortable with your lineup? All right, so I'll take a different approach with what I think Jay will say. I'll say that it depends on the how the slate is shaping up for that day. So if there are like crazy good bargain plays at like 4K, right, and you find yourself with like $1,000 left over or something, it just depends on how it is. So if they're like slam dunk cheap bargain plays on the slate that you really like, and you have that much money left over, then I'm fine with it. It just depends on if they are out there. On a normal day where it's a little hard to find value, and they're not like great options out there under 4K or 4,500, then I generally look to cap it around 300, 400 left. That's probably the general area that I'm aiming for, but I think there are definitely exceptions that Jay will get into right now.
Yeah, I love this question. I think people definitely overvalue leftover salary to the point that it can be detrimental to their lineups. For sure, I've left 1,000 on the table earlier this season on DraftKings, and even tonight I left 700 on FanDuel and 500 on DraftKings. And obviously, it's not like this every night. I mean, tonight I went for Reed over Thaddeus Young on FanDuel, and that was a 600 difference. So there are scenarios like that pop up often, and I think you shouldn't let the price push you to a guy that just because he's more, you have to go, even though you like the guy less. There are plenty of nights you can like Blake Griffin more than fragile Anthony Davis. These scenarios pop up. So I think overall, it's not something to really freak out over, especially if you have 200 or 300 left. But if you have more than that, I think it's definitely very important to go through each player on your team and make sure there's nothing you're missing. Even do a 2-for-2 swap. Like tonight, I had 700 left over, and I was like, well, that's a lot on a 10-game slate. What am I missing? And, I really had to break it down and say, okay, do I like these guys more than this guy, even though I can fit this guy? And it's not something you deliberately want to do. Leave over this much salary. Prices are tight right now, and on these big slates, obviously we want to use the salary we're given, but overall, I think it's nothing to change your whole mindset and kind of change your lineup that you're working for. If you have these players in your mind and everything works out, you make your lineup right away and they all fit, and you have 400 left over, leave it. I mean, that's fine. And this isn't even getting into kind of GPPs where you can have really unique lineups by leaving 400 or 500 over that other people won't, especially in those big fields.
Yeah, I'll end with just one point off what Jay said is just because a player is priced more than another player doesn't mean he's a better option. I think people make that assumption way too often, and it's it's not true more times than you think. All right, so next question is from nbarnett83. What's the best way to use the site information while working a full-time job? First of all, I don't even know what that is. That's crazy talk.
That's outrageous. Yeah, I mean, I don't understand it.
All right, so what I would suggest is start the day. Go and look at some over/unders. Go and take a cursory glance at the models. See which players stick out to you. Jot some names down, some studs, some mid-range guys, some value plays. Be caught up on injuries. Just go on with like a good snapshot of what the general day will look like. You don't need to do like an hour of research. Just sit at your desk, pretend like you're doing some work, and then sneak a couple peeks here and there. There's the office function where you could press the button and some Excel spreadsheet comes up, and you can game the system that way a little bit. So I think you just have to get a general idea of what things are like. Then I generally wouldn't suggest like really getting set on a lineup until I don't know a couple hours before lock, just because you don't want to go in too rigid and not be flexible enough when all those inevitable late news breaks and values change and whatnot. So Yeah, I think, come up with a good idea. Then I really think, especially in NBA, around an hour or two before lock, it definitely requires more like your full attention, just with all the news that comes through. And I think having our models page open, we're seeing the news that comes through, and then we make all the changes and the projections for you. So I think you're generally okay kind of taking that approach.
Yeah, this is all for me. It's all about preparation and multitasking. Assuming that you have enough time and you have access kind of to a computer or your phone. I mean, it's the same thing as like weddings or school. You got to sneak your looks or you got to make time. But I think if you're playing for a lot of money, I think it's absolutely crucial that you're definitely around, even if you have a great lineup in mind. For NBA specifically, that you are absolutely glued to the internet basically at least 30 minutes before up until lineups lock. Otherwise, long term, the edge is there for everybody else, and if you're losing that edge, you're not going to be a winning player. So kind of juggling it with work is obviously an individual case by case if you can handle it. Obviously you have to put in the work before, the night before, break it down a little bit. And really the question, the best way, if you're going to do this, the best way to use that information, I would say I wouldn't even consider really doing it honestly myself. But now with our app, I think you can get away with it for sure. With the models on the app and Twitter on your phone, I think that's the route that I would kind of take.
All right. So next question, Frank1825. Which ratings do you put the most trust in when making a lineup? Yeah, so I talked about this earlier. Projected plus minus for me, floor and ceiling, and then you look at things like pace differential, usage rate, and you can put some things in there like bargain rating and pro trends are kind of like more tiebreaker type things for me. But the ones that I mentioned earlier are kind of like my bread and butter foundation of what I look at.
Yep, same for me. And along those lines, if that's not satisfying enough, I like to really look at minutes for each team. I'll sort the model by team and look at the minutes structure for these players. And that's how you can kind of realize what teams are thin. Like tonight, the Grizzlies were very thin, so it was ideal to kind of go some of those cheaper guys in cash. So along with pace and Vegas total, I think floor is really big for cash, ceiling for tournament, along with all of the ratings that we have. Those are all kind of things you look at together, and it's kind of how you build your lineups.
All right, next question is Party Crasher from Michael Parr. Cool. Pretty creative.
Clever pun name, yeah. I like it.
When constructing a lineup, do you have a set number of positions that you predetermine as punt plays? Okay, so on one end, I don't think you should ever come in with like a set idea of what you want. I think every slate is unique, and you want to be flexible. I think being flexible is probably one of the most important things I would recommend. You don't want to come in with, I'm going to play this, 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 and this, because then you don't open yourselves up for different lineup constructions or options that might be more optimal. But okay, if we're talking like generalities here, in cash, I wouldn't go more than 3. Because for the simple reason that if you have more than 3, then you open yourselves up for guys dropping eggs and just like bombing your lineup, and you're going to have a little bit too many holes in there. Like we talked about with cash, floor is really important, and you want guys who don't get open your team up for roster spots where you're only getting fewer than 20 DK points in a given night. I mean, you want guys who have that high floor that won't, destroy your lineup. So I would say ideally around 2 makes sense for kind of cheaper punt plays, and that can vary depending on the slate from 1 to 3.
Yeah, it's very slate specific, slate dependent, and nothing for me is absolutely set. I think with NBA especially, there are no really hard rules, especially coming to punt plays. But there's certainly nights where for cash games, you look at even tonight with Jameer, he was kind of the first guy I put in on both sites, and that's kind of predetermined. I determined that last night that I was going to use Jameer as my punt play at point guard. But you're not really generally looking for a certain amount. Depends on the slate and kind of the price of the top players and the floor of the punt plays. So it predetermined, you got to look at all these things as a whole, the slate size, the top players, the consistency of these punt plays, and how much you can rely on them.
All right, so next question. Fantic Flyer with the PH, shout out. How many different lineups do you have for cash games on average? All right, so this is a question that we get often, and I would say there's not a correct answer for this. There are two really smart and sharp cash game players that I know, Peter Jennings, Adam Levitan, and they both had different philosophies on this. Adam Levitan only runs out 1 or 2 cash game lineups on a given slate. Peter Jennings, CSU Ram, runs out as many as 6 to 8. And I don't think there's a right answer for this. I think it just kind of depends on your tolerance for risk, and if you're willing to roll out, just kind of put all your eggs in one basket and have just one cash lineup in there. For me personally, I just answer this personally. I'm on the end of the spectrum closer to Adam. I'll only run 1 or 2 cash lineups per night. And most of the times I'll only run 1. I'll run 2 if a guy in my main cash lineup is I feel a little bit nervous about. If it's Anthony Davis for injury risk, if it's a punt play that I feel has its semi good chance of busting that night, I'll roll out another lineup, a variation of that cash lineup. So for me, it's 1 to 2, but I don't think there's like a right answer for this question.
Yeah, assuming you're an above average player, your ROI will be higher with one lineup. But at the same time, and speaking of Pete and Adam, I think a lot of that has to do with how much you're getting out there in action. If you're betting like $100K a week, I would play 6 to 8 lineups. Me personally, I use 1, maybe 2. In NFL, I usually find myself using 2 because injuries are more prone. So hedging makes sense in those terms, but it's kind of more safety, less upside, you could say, for your ROI in cash games. I think generally 1 to 2 is good, but if you're getting a lot of money out there and you want to kind of hedge your risk, which is obviously very understandable, then the more the better. So it kind of depends on that, what kind of action you're putting out there and each night relative to your bankroll and really just relative to money, So yeah, for me it's 1 or 2, but I can definitely see the multiple lineups.
I also think it depends on the person too, because Pete is one of the best guys I know at putting multiple lineups together. He can do that very well. He can put together 50 to 100 lineups and have them be all pretty solid too. And that's a trait that very few people have. And I don't think a lot of people, even probably including myself, have the ability to put together 6 to 8 cash game lineups on a slate that I feel really good about. I would never, if you're considering kind of getting in that territory, I would never recommend you do it just for the sake of doing it. I would recommend you do it if you can do it well, and because if you do it just for the sake of doing it, your ROI on each of those lineups iterations will go down. So what's the point of doing that if you're just gonna lose money with that 6th, 7th, and 8th lineup that you're making? Right.
Yeah. His hedges are limiting his risk in a really smart way. So if that's the way you want to do it, then that's kind of what you have to do. Your lineup still has to be really good. It's not as simple as just, I'm going to do a 2-for-2 switch just for the fun of it, or have a different lineup out there. It's a calculated switch, and it helps limit your risk.
All right. So last question we have here from Train All Day 247. What's the number one thing you weigh highly in your NBA projections that most other projection systems probably overlook? So if you're talking raw projections, I'll say this I'll speak to both things. So raw projections, I think we do a really good job at looking at and trying to nail down minutes. I think that's one thing that I try to do better than anybody else. So on every single day, every player well, I do their minutes individually, and that's taking into account rotation changes, recent blowouts that have skewed their minutes up or down, blowout potential for their current game, and just a number of factors, just news or whatever that comes out. So I think our minutes are pretty tight, and know that they're done manually by hand every day, not just automated. So I think that's one thing that sets us apart. And another thing is just the usage part too, is making sure a team as a whole makes sense and fits together, where we're not over projecting usage, under projecting usage, and it all makes sense in a bigger picture. I think if you kind of go through individual player by player, you can kind of overshoot things a little bit, especially if players are coming back, new players are being reintroduced into the lineup that were not in the lineup in previous days, previous games, and that type of thing. So that's what I would say. The two things that I focus on probably more than your average projections that you'll find out there. And another thing, going to the system. The system is what I think is most advantageous for using Fantasy Labs. Is when you're looking at all the other systems out there, it's just simple projections. It's projection, raw projection, total projection for that day, and then points per dollar. That's pretty much two things. In our projection system, you can weigh all these different variables, all these different sliders, weigh them differently according to your needs, floor, ceiling, bargain rating, all these different factors that are not available for you to factor in on other systems, you are able to have on Fantasy Labs.
Yeah, you nailed that. I mean, that's the name of the game. Anyone can kind of look up basic stats for players and minutes per game, and you can kind of add a bump here and there and decrease here and there. But what our models are doing is it's so individual. Every single player, is taken care of, and I think that's by far the most valuable that other sites might overlook, and a lot of sites might overproject players. We factor in, like, is Tony Douglas playing or not? And that's factored in, a fourth string point guard or third string, whatever. Guys like that really alter the landscape of the whole model, really. And those are all things that are looked at, and usage rates, I think, are huge. And in that all the team totals add up and make sense is probably the most important thing.
All right. So, I think that about does it. I think that I don't even know how long we went, but I hope it wasn't 2 hours. I don't think it was 2 hours, but we never know.
So time flies. It could be Thursday. I
don't know. Yeah, I got to check my phone and see what day we're at.
Yeah.
All right. So, thanks again for all the really good questions. Seriously, like these, I was expecting at least a couple people to troll us with some Austin Rivers questions or something, or some smart ass questions, but we got some really good ones this time.
Yeah, I was really impressed, actually. I joked that it was like Bill Simmons. I thought Justin was writing all the questions himself for this, so it was really good, and I enjoyed answering them, and I'd like to do this again with a new set of questions, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll have a pod Tuesday night, breaking down the Wednesday slate. I think it'll be you and Brian, right, Jay?
Yep. Yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow night with a pod with Brian breaking down the Wednesday slate.
All right, thanks, guys.
Yep. Thanks a lot. See you guys.